Please welcome Sonal Giani to QueerTWENTY, the cohort of 2021. Sonal is a renowned activist, filmmaker. She's also the co-founder of Umang, Yarya and the Q family, all with an aim towards LGBTQ empowerment. Thank you so much, Sonal, for joining us.
Thank you. I'm really excited.
So, Sonal, a very important question right at the start. Children are often kept completely in the dark about the identity spectrum. How do you think that this should be rectified?
I agree that children are very much kept in the dark about their identity spectrum. I think what should be happening is that we need to talk about sexuality more openly in schools. One finds the resistance because, parents think that they kind of reduce sexuality to just the physical act. I think it's important to move away from that narrative and talk about desire in general, talk about safety, consent. I think those are great entry points to talk about different kinds of relationships. What also helps is that if you have cultural tools like, say, films or plays, those are all good entry points. And I think definitely it should be an initiative from the government as well, where they are looking at sensitizing within schools, because what we are finding is that bullying is very, very common as an experience of queer persons growing up, and especially when it comes to trans individuals, a lot of them drop out of school owing to it, and that of course affects their livelihood in the long run.
So, Sonal, if I had to talk about your journey, what have been the 3 most defining moments in your life?
I think there have been 3 defining moments in my life. I think like the first one sort of being coming to terms with my own sexuality. It took me a lot of time, but when I finally sort of accepted myself for who I was, I think it changed something for me. I was much more open to finding support. But this happened many, many years later. This was when I was around 18. I think the second defining point was, there were many instances of me experiencing homophobia. And that experience of homophobia sort of drove me to take up mental health therapy. And because of getting into a counseling room, I became much more self-aware, and I also was able to unwrap, the different kind of shame that I have around my gender and my sexuality. So getting into a counseling room, I think definitely another very important point. And I think the third would be when I started community work. I joined the Humsafar Trust as a very young person. I was around 22, 23, and I was a volunteer. But as I started working, within community spaces for the community and started interacting with the larger public about the issue, things changed for me, because, a kind of, when the activism is very mainstream, you get a sense of the people and the climate around you, which is very different from when you are coming out alone. So I think because of a combination of these 3, I am someone who is much more comfortable with my gender, my sexuality. I'm able to be much more open in public and talk about this issue. And of course, able to handle any kind of homophobia or homophobic statements, just simply because of the kind of support system I have and awareness that I have,
It is so amazing to hear that you are at a point in your life where you are more aware and that you know how to introspect that leads to healing. But in this entire process from the start, maybe, how has your support system evolved?
So when I was coming out, there was no queer groups which were very out, right? And we had heard of Gay Bombay and the Humsafar Trust, but this was largely catering to men. There weren't support groups. There were support groups for lesbian women, bisexual women, but it was very, very underground and access was very difficult. Which is why it took me about 5-6 years after being out to even find one. 5-6 years to nahi, 2-3 saal lage the, 2-3 years to sort of find it. Now the situation is very different, because when I was coming out, that time I was amongst the 3-4 people in the country who were out and speaking openly. But now, now a good decade later, what we find is that there are many voices and people who are out. If you are a young individual who is looking for support, you only have to get onto a social media handle and you will find an influencer speaking on the subject, and there are many who are sort of doing that. My only critique of is that, like, I think like when I was sort of growing up, it was very much rooted in groundwork as well. So right now what happens is that there's a lot of social media connection, but not so much connecting back into physical spaces. So I'm hoping that that sort of changes. But even then, it's like it's a world of change, from when I was coming out to right now. Plus, also when I was, when I was coming out that time, the law wasn't friendly and things were very hidden. They were like, you would have heard of just 2-3 people. But since that time to now, there are corporates who are much more supportive. Workplaces have now, they are consciously looking to hire queer persons. Even when you talk about mainstream media or Bollywood films and things like that, now representation बहुत high है. Representation is much better right now. So, I mean, as a young person growing up, you at least see some queerness or the subject being spoken, so you have some idea of it. As in comparison to earlier, where it was very much like kind of lonely journey and trying to figuring it out yourself, and very much hidden. So I think what's nice is that the queer people who are like born this year, like they are born in a free India, and so their actions and their expression, everything is very free.
A lot of public forums actually have this information that you were outed without your choice.
Yeah.
Is that true? And if true, how did that impact your mental processes and your worldview in general?
Yeah, so in my case, I mean, I was outed without my consent, and even before I had accepted my sexuality, right? Just rumors were spread in my college, same in my the first workplace. That time I was not very confident about my sexuality, and I had not accepted it within myself, which was the biggest, I think, sort of problem. So I think like I was always on the defensive, and like I internalized the shame that came with that kind of public humiliation. So of course that has left kind of emotional scars on me, that time period. So which is why I kind of don't sort of, and also I mean there was a situation where things were, it became a safety threat as well. So I think like it's very important to in general, not just from my experience, I'm saying like in general, from knowing the experiences of different people as well, that's so important that you maintain confidentiality, and you cannot push somebody to come out, even if you are the person's partner and you are invested in a romantic kind of way. Even then, the journey of coming out is completely personal. You can help people along the way, but you should not be forcing them or pushing them. That's when it sort of works the best. And I think like a lot of stress is put on people to come out in their respective social spaces. What's important is that people come out about their support, and instead of putting the entire onus of making the space friendly by the community person coming out, we have to be open, passionate and supportive, and fighting any kind of transphobic or homophobic statements around, instead of like the other way around.
Sonal, if I now talk about India as a whole, where do you think India stands in the global landscape when it comes to LGBTQ inclusion at work? Do you see a difference, especially after Section 377 was abolished?
Yeah, I think like in terms of India and the global landscape, we are definitely making huge strides compared to like countries where the movement has been like at least more than 70-80 years old. India still has a very young movement. We are just about 20-30 years old, the movement really, especially in the mainstream, though it's only really from 2009 2010 that we are finding. For that short period of time, I think like the change has been huge, especially in the corporates, because now there is diversity sort of hiring happening. People are very openly working on making the spaces more inclusive. However, like I feel like it's very much restricted to MNCs and not so much in small scale or like your local enterprises or so I think like that is something where we kind of things sort of need to change. Globally, I'll also say that like we are like, while we don't have legal rights, like we don't have marriage rights and we don't have, other rights, in comparison to our neighborly states, the progress has been, like, it's more far, the progress has been, like, in comparison to the other countries around us, neighboring countries, we are obviously in a better place, because right now in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, it's still criminal to be queer. And the thing is that, like, when these kind of judgments happen in any country, they of course affect, international judgments are taken into consideration, especially in cases like these. So they aid, especially that, these other countries, for them to sort of fight for their rights. Yeah, but I think, like, one would have expected that the legal rights situation would follow more speedily, which has not happened. And when the decriminalization happened, the Supreme Court had a bunch of recommendations in terms of what are the kind of implementations that have to happen in the government space as well as private space. And especially when it came to lawmakers and law enforcement agencies, the kind of sensitization work that needs to sort of happen, I have not seen it translate that effectively. I think that most of the change that is happening in social spaces is driven by community people. At some point, you are connected with a community person who has supported you. It's not coming in the way it should, from people in power. And this marriage debate is still going on, and, like, our government currently feels that it's a non-issue, and we are still, given arguments like it's against tradition, and so, so one sort of feels that it may take longer, whereas, I mean, it should just immediately follow. That's just the logical way to go about things, but I think it'll be slow,
And obviously, the media has played a huge role. I mean, the blatant misrepresentation, the lack of representation historically has had such immense traumatic repercussions.
No, I think, like, when it has come to queer cinema, things are changing simply because we have queer film festivals happening in the country, and they are very well recognized. So, because of the presence of film festivals and avenues to screen films about the subject, more filmmakers are making queer-themed films. I feel like Bollywood still has a very long way to go. I just feel like the filmmakers don't do their homework enough in terms of their research. Once in a while, one or two films will come, which will be sort of sensitive, but then it'll be followed with some content which is very kind of phobic. So, I mean, the way things are going is that, like, queer filmmakers have started to make their own films, and they are finding funding support. So that is interesting. Like, that the power of telling the story is being reclaimed by queer people instead of somebody using us as, I don't know, like, just to, sensationalize having a character like that. So I personally also I also make films themed on issues of queer persons. It's been quite interesting to kind of see that how there are different people and agencies who have started coming in and supporting in terms of grants, but this is still, except for PSPT, which has really supported mainstream film documentaries, we haven't really seen as many grants coming in from Indians or Indian agencies. It's mostly been like individuals who are funding, or organizations who are from outside who are coming in and funding. So one hopes that, there is more support in that kind of way. And also that what is happening is that nowadays, because of the power of social media, if there is any kind of content which is problematic, it is being called out by the queer community, which is no longer, hiding. They're very out and open in their social media, so their critique of the way a certain film is made or any art form is representing the community, it's very vocal, and they are very like, they do feel empowered enough to question and challenge the representation. So I think, like, that's been quite interesting. But I still feel like, see, Bollywood is still there is nepotism in Bollywood, right? So, like, it's still very close to, I think, queer filmmakers coming in and making films. We still see that, when they are having a role which is a queer role, especially trans person, like, the character is a trans person, they don't hire an actor from the trans community. So I think those things need to sort of change, and one hopes that it will, and I'm pretty sure it will, because the community started to hold them accountable,
This actually beautifully brings me to the next question. What are your hopes for the next generation of queer leaders? I mean, which Indian emerging queer leader should we be looking out for?
No, I think I'm very, very hopeful of young people. I think they are doing amazing work, and I think like they need to be given more platforms. And like I would personally like to retire, and although I'm not so old, but like you guys are very energetic and you're very enthused, like sort of take over, and they are. I mean, like it's not even a question of taking over. They're doing amazing, exceptional work. So some of the people, especially in the young lot that I'm very, very sort of fond of is there is a trans person named Anjali who works with the Humsafar Trust, Dinesh Chopde who works with the Humsafar Trust. Dinesh has an extensive background also of working in smaller cities also. And when I look at like, the Northeast, there is a group called Ya All. They are doing some great work there. I've heard of Arwakant who's working on the intersection of gender and caste. Then there are other younger people who are also working on the intersection of faith and sexuality. So it's been interesting to see how a bunch of them are kind of coming up. And I mean, then you also have your mainstream influencers who are people like, Sushant Devgikar, Anvesh Sahu. So for me, like I feel like that's all, it's quite promising, the way they're actually occupying the space and making sort of change happen. My heart is kind of more set on young people from smaller towns who don't get that kind of visibility and they don't become quote unquote influencer. Like that, there are sort of many kids who, like, they are countless, So for me, like I'm more, I would say, I'm more looking forward to their work. I mean, I'm sure that, the ones who are in the limelight, like I'm pretty sure that they will do the work that needs to be done, but I'm more, I'm more invested in the growth of people from smaller towns, So which is why whenever I get a chance to maybe be part of like any leadership training program or a capacity building program for young people, newbies, like I jumped at that idea, so.
And it is so impressive and heartwarming to see how these leaders from tier 2 and tier 3 cities have been working with less than half or negligible resources that that are available in metropolitan cities.
And the initiative, and also see the violence is much higher. The publicity is much more, right? If you are in a small town, you're doing like the impact of that work. It's much more difficult, I think, to be working in a small town. And I think like they are doing some exceptional work. And I feel like more of their work should be recorded, within the movement. Right now, it's very much the movement is documented from the eyes of like upper caste, cis, heterosexual males. So I feel like, it's important to see, the intersection also that is happening. Any intersection that's happening, and especially from places where the first language is not English,
Could you tell us a bit more about Yarya and Umang and the driving forces behind them?
So I joined the Humsafar Trust as an advocacy officer when I was a young person. And while we were there, the CEO of the Humsafar Trust wanted to work with young people, and that is the time he consulted a bunch of people who were young at that time, and we got together and we co-founded a group. So there were about 10 of us who co-founded Yarya. Yarya began as a space for event space actually for young people, but we very soon realized that there are other mental health needs and other rights related work that needs to be done with young people. So it very quickly became more than an event space. It became more like a safe space for kind of capacity building the young people. So the way Yarya works is that there are 10 volunteers who form the core team, who keep changing, who organize the different events based on the needs of the community. That is Yarya. But I mean, I moved out of Yarya because Yarya has a youth group. So at 28, you need to retire. So of course, I have retired. But then there is the other group, Umang, which is a support space for lesbians, bisexual women and transmasculine persons based out of Mumbai. This is again a safe space only, but it used to initially have a physical space. We had an office where we used to sort of meet. So one vertical of that was community mobilization, and from the mobilization assuring networking and socializing within the communities, but also had a health section where you can access mental health therapists or doctors and things like that. And then also you can access legal support in case of crisis situations and things like that. And it had a research related wing as well, which was actually because it's a Humsafar Trust initiative, whatever the support spaces available to people in Humsafar were available to people in Umang as well. But this group is very much run by LBT for LBT, and the trust steps in for financial reasons and things like that. But the decision making and the crisis case handling and connecting and linkage is very much by LBT for LBT. The group is still around. I continue to be the core team of that group. Both Yarya and Umang are about 10 years old now, more than 10 years, 2010, 11 years.
Sonal, as a final question, and this is purely because of short of time, what advice would you give to young women who are unsure and they don't know how to come out?
Yeah, I think it's if you are somebody who's unsure on how to come out, when to come out, I would really highly recommend that you watch my YouTube video. The video is on my YouTube channel. It's called How to Come Out to Indian Parents, where I kind of delve very deeply into the subject. But if you're kind of not sure, I would recommend connecting with a support space and getting in touch with a therapist if you are not even comfortable going into a counselor. There are many queer affirmative therapists who are available. One of the organizations that you can kind of reach out to is the Humsafar Trust. You can ask them for a contact detail of the NGO or the support group or a collective in your area. They will very easily be able to, recommend you. And then you can move from there. Otherwise, there are lists also available, queer affirmative counselors, you could go through that. But I have divided this much more deeply in my YouTube video. So I would really highly recommend that you watch that.
Thank you so much, Sonal, and we will ensure that we link your video in this interview so that it can reach wider audiences. And we cannot thank you enough for being a part of QueerTWENTY, for coming here and speaking to us. Thank you so much, Sonal.
Thank you.